and let's chat about inclusive education. Our goal during these chats is to introduce you to individuals who are working to make schools inclusive. I'm Gordon Porter, the Director of Inclusive Education Canada, and I'm joined today by my colleagues, Diane Richler, who's the chair of the Catalyst for Inclusive Education, and that's an initiative of Inclusion International. Diane's also a former Executive Vice President of Inclusion Canada. And my colleague, Jackie Speck, who's a professor of education at Western University in London, Ontario, and director of the Canadian Research Centre on Inclusive Education. We're your hosts, and our guest today is Gillian Parekh, a professor at York University in Toronto, and a former teacher and consultant with the Toronto District School Board. Today, we want to find out more about Gillian's work. So welcome, Gillian, and tell us about yourself and how you come to be working in the field of inclusive education.
Sure. Well, thank you, and thanks so much for having me be part of your panel today. I really do appreciate your interest in the work and in our collective work together. I guess I will start with, well, I'm a prof at York University. I'm actually a Canada Research Chair in the field of inclusion, disability, and education. And so the primary role I play is around research. My trajectory into working into the field of inclusive education, I think began quite young. I've had a number of different experiences with disability in my life, but the one that connects me to inclusive education would probably come mostly from my brother's experience. He was born with cerebral palsy, and my parents were committed advocates in ensuring that he had an inclusive education place in all throughout school. And so I was involved in discussions and advocacy work from quite young. Maybe not so much advocacy work when I was really young, but I certainly was part of those dinner table discussions and shared the concerns and the worries my parents had for his education. And there were a lot of bumps in the road that my parents had to really navigate around. I think to be fair, his journey in inclusion wasn't smooth. It was far from perfect. I would argue that his experience was probably more emblematic of an integrated approach. He was in a classroom that had, for his full childhood and even into high school, who had a number of accommodations that were embedded within the programming, which was excellent. He had excellent support. He had a fabulous EA with him almost his whole life. He had access to technology when technology wasn't really a thing, like back in like the late 80s, early 90s, when you brought a computer and it would require like its own space and table in the classroom. And he also had a service dog that accompanied him to school. So all of these accommodations, while incredibly important, how they were integrated within the actual inclusion and cohesiveness of the classroom didn't always work. So academically, he ended up doing really well. He ended up being able to pursue graduate school following university. But socially, it was really, really hard. And so having that experience and moving to Toronto, I became a teacher. My goal was to work in special education. And I had never encountered schools for students who were just for students with disabilities. And when I arrived to kind of do a tour of a few schools when we were going through the job application process, I came across these spaces in which they were self-contained sites for special education. And I found that that the emphasis on social relationships in those spaces was wonderful. And when we went in, there was so much acknowledgement of and celebration of diversity within those spaces. And yet when I pulled back and looked at the system more broadly and looked at the futures of children that went through these schools, it was a pretty bleak picture. So nothing ever really sat right with me overall. And so I ended up pursuing graduate work in the field of critical disability studies. And I always kind of share that it was for some like a come to Jesus moment. It was the moment where all of the questions that my family had struggled with, all of the questions that I had struggled with in terms of understanding disability discrimination, understanding disability exclusion, thinking about disability justice and the role that schools play in that became more clear. So from there, I ended up actually being quite fortunate working with the Toronto District School Board in their research department, which allowed me to take those questions around critical disability and investigate them at a system level with schools. So that's kind of how I ended up, my kind of trajectory through here, and then ended up at York.
So where did your brother and yourself go to school?
So we were in Nova Scotia.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So the move to Toronto and the Toronto school system was quite different for you.
Yeah, it was.
What
Expansive.
so you I know that people who've looked up anything about your work will know that you've done a lot of research. You did a lot of it when you were working internally in the Toronto District School Board, and you always had
very bravely, I should say.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And it seems to me that you were always presenting the positive case for inclusion. But for those of us who look at Ontario and Toronto from outside, the Toronto District School District is not an exemplar of inclusive education even today. What do you think? What's the connection there? Like, why is that the case? What makes it so difficult?
Within the TDSB?
Yeah.
I think I do think its size plays a role. It is the largest school system in all of Canada. So I feel like navigating or re-steering a ship that size does account for some aspects of it. But I also think that it is historically had a number of had a real commitment to special education, and the structures of special education were kind of ingrained within the system from very early on. So there's a lot, when we think about moving towards more inclusion, there's a lot more to undo, if that makes sense, than perhaps other boards that didn't have such an entrenched system from the ground up, from the get-go. Yeah. I will say though that the TDSB has been incredibly supportive of the research that we've conducted through the system around inclusion, and they have enabled us to present and publish some of the work that's been done, and they are responsive in terms of the data. So a lot of school boards don't collect the data that TDSB collects. They don't allow for these kinds of analyses to happen, and certainly therefore they don't have to adhere to the results and the findings. But TDSB does make the effort and has a committed has committed folks dedicated.
I've noted that as well, and I found it encouraging that because to me the outputs at the delivery level are not what I would be looking for, but the fact that they do the kind of research that you and your colleagues have done is a plus.
Absolutely, yeah.
Can I live in Toronto. I have many grandchildren in the Toronto system, so I'm very interested in it. But I want to go back to something that you said earlier that I found that really struck me. And that was when you said that, you know, when you toured schools in Toronto and you saw the separate programs, how new that was to you. And I expected your next sentence to be, and how horrible they were, but it wasn't, because you did find something really of value there in terms of their respect for individuals and the fact that they fostered these kinds of friendships. Have you learned from that experience? Because certainly that remains a challenge, and I think a fear for a lot of families, that going into a regular class where your child might be the only one who has a disability, you know, too many stories of kids not being invited to the birthday parties and those kinds of things. Do you have any suggestions? Have you learned about what what's the good that we can take out of those experiences and build into inclusive systems?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and something that I'm currently trying to write about now as I grapple with that exact question. Um, and as I read more work being put out by disabled people around disabled histories, and thinking about the role of thinking about the role of celebrating disability identity, as well as providing opportunities for youth, particularly disabled youth, to come together and organize and become a collective and have a collective voice in something, while still ensuring that those exclusionary policies and practices are removed from schools and school systems. So you're exactly that. I'm trying to think about those very questions right now. But I think one of the key questions that I'm stuck with from my experience, because I strongly believe in inclusion. I believe that I don't think my brother would have ever made it to graduate school if he had not been if my parents hadn't been advocating for him the entire way through in an inclusive system or an integrated system at best. And but I always have the question in the back of my mind about, like, inclusion into what? So what exactly are we asking parents and children and youth to be included into? Because if we still maintain ableist structures, and there's ableism and exclusion that are rampant in classrooms and rampant in schools, that's not going to be successful either, right? So I think that there has to be real attention to more than just, and I know that all of you think this as well, there has to be more attention to just putting children together and being like, all right, it's done, we've done it, or removing special education, say, okay, it's done, now we're de facto inclusive. Like that also will not work.
Can you give some examples? I mean, I'm thinking of the families who are going to be watching this and the teachers who are going to be watching this, and, you know, thinking about, like, what can we do differently? What needs to happen differently?
Well, I think it's funny, I was just chatting with a group of grad students yesterday, and we were discussing some of these components around what does make the difference. And there's a lot of discussion around re-including histories of disabled people that have been removed from our curriculum, including stories, having greater representation, having teachers with disabilities working in the schools. Like all of those components that we talk about in terms of like culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy can also be applied to how we think about disability within schools. So I think those are some kind of at least direct initiatives that can begin within classrooms and schools to start bringing around that change.
And I wonder too, I mean, you talked before about that creating identity, right? And so, I mean, we don't all just identify with one aspect, right, of our religion or our gender or our sexuality or our ability. So, you know, perhaps it is saying you can have a voice as a disabled person and still be included, right? Just like we do for all of our other people who identify in different ways. And so I'm just wondering about how would that look in schools, right? If we think about, you know, if we have gay straight alliances, then, you know, do we do something like that for people with disabilities also? Or is there something different we could be doing within our schools?
Yes, 100%. In fact, there was a student that was looking into that exact, you know, thinking about what gay straight alliances tell us about you know, collective identity and political identity around you know, disability. So how that can be implemented. That's an excellent example. Yeah.
Because it's almost, again, that, you know, to me anyway, in my work and my looking at around all of these issues of identity, that disability still seems to get left out, and that disability is still bad, right? And so I think, as you say, those ableist structures and it really reframing, and that I always like to think about, you know, it's okay to be different. And I think that's what we miss, right? We talk about inclusion, but we still want to think that everybody ought to be the same. And that just doesn't make sense because we don't do that for anything else in our identity structures.
Absolutely. One of the things that we talk about, I worked on a document with Catherine Underwood, and we talked about, inclusion is not assimilation. It's not, one of the things we sometimes hear when we walk into classrooms is, oh, I've done such a great job at inclusion that you can't tell who the disabled student is in my class. And that's not the goal. The goal is to celebrate those identities within classrooms and have them reflected within the curriculum. I have a grad student, Aaron Richmond, who is doing his thesis on looking at representation of young adult fiction and disability representation, and just looking at how our curriculum and how the materials we use for curriculum, how that positions disability to make it an other or something to be undesired or something to be devalued. Even in the texts that we read that are just part of the common, English classes, for example, and how teachers can begin by adopting texts that celebrate that identity, that don't position disabled characters as people who have to be fixed or cured to be okay in the end of a novel, right? So even integrating those pieces, I think, will be really helpful. I also think it's really important that we have teachers with disabilities in the classroom as representation too, so that those stereotypes around capacity can be challenged.
So here's another. Oh, sorry, Gordon. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, as a university teacher, what are you finding out about the attitudes and mindset of your students about inclusive education that may be different from the time when you were there?
That's a great question. I'm just right now in the process of teaching a 200 plus class on inclusion for free service candidates, and I've been really impressed by the level of criticality they are bringing to the course material and the full embrace around disability that they have exhibited through their work and through their engagement within the class. What I find hardest from having taught in different programs like at U of T and York as well, is when students leave the classroom space where they're like, yeah, disability justice, we're on it, we're gonna make this happen, and they go out to practicum, and then they come back and we have to hold sessions where we grieve together about, oh my gosh, like I walked down the hallway and someone was like, you wouldn't believe what I heard, you wouldn't believe how kids are spoken about or how they're talked about, in front of other kids, in front of, like, it's just by other kids, by people within the school. Like it wasn't at all what they were expecting. And it's hard as a new teacher to go into cultures that are have already kind of adopted that ableist attitude, right?
Any ideas about what it would take to sort of shock a system that's been entrenched in traditional special education practice, probably quite richly, with a lot of money being spent on it for so long? What do you think it would take?
A lot of money would be good.
A lot more money?
Got a lead, Gordon?
Spent on what?
I think that the TDSB is doing a lot of, TDSB is pretty much all, I know some other boards are working on these around Ontario as well. But I think there is a lot of anxiety around transitioning away from the familiar. And it's interesting because I'm sure you all get the same questions when you present places, but the first question I get is, well, prove to me that inclusion works. Like, show me the numbers, right? But I never hear, show me or prove to me that what we're doing works right now. Like, I never hear that. And there's just so little accountability around the current system. And so I think but it's the familiar, right? So transitioning out of that really takes a lot of courage. And I think that, I will always ask for more funding for public education. I think that we could always do with more. But I think it could also ease some anxiety for sure. Not that but I think that everyone that works in the system is 100% capable of making that move, but it's just, it always helps.
What kind of measurements do you think would create that anxiety among the general public?
What kind, sorry?
Well,
Gordon?
what kind of measurements, what kind of information, what kind of research would you have to use to get anxiety among the general public that what's happening now is not appropriate?
Part of me thinks research can be persuasive, but I think there are limitations to how much it can persuade at times. And I think that what needs to I think a lot of the anxiety comes from, because our system is so segregated around capacity, or around imagined capacity, I should say, that a lot of, and even as a, you know, going through school, like, and I think about my own schooling experiences, how often I was in a class with other students with disabilities. Like it was, had I not had my family's experiences, my own, like it would have been very, I'm having a hard time even thinking of when that would have been. So I think for a lot of educators, that's also their experience. And I think that it's the unknown. And because we continue to organize students around these notions of capacity, that a lot of times many educators have never even been in relationship with or had an opportunity to meet and get to know students with disabilities. And so I think there's a lot of anxiety about doing it wrong, or doing it wrong in terms of setting up the classroom wrong, your lessons will be wrong, your pedagogy will be wrong, you won't be able to manage. Like, I think all of that comes from just the unknown, but we won't be able to erode that unknowingness until we start start integrating, including more students with disabilities.
So I've been working much more internationally over the last 20 years. And 20 years ago, I had a much better sense of what was happening across the country. And I think you could count the number of university professors who were supportive of or interested in inclusion on one hand, and you wouldn't even need all your fingers.
Wow.
It was not part of the university curriculum. There just wasn't that interest. I just find it so encouraging, just the number of people that we're going to be chatting with in this series who are affiliated with universities, people like you and Jackie and others who, aren't just committed, and you're not just talking off the top of your heads. I mean, you have solid experience and you have really good examples, but somehow there still seems to be a disconnect. Like, there's been a real change at the university level, but there's still so much struggle. And, we focused on the Toronto board because that's where a lot of your research has been. And certainly it stands out across Canada as being, the largest and most segregated system. But families all across the country are still struggling to get their kids into regular school. So, I guess I'm just wondering, there are all these changes at the university level. What has to happen for it to be at the system administration level? Like, where are the directors of education who believe what you and Jackie believe?
So I can give you just an example of some of the work that's happening that has been really positive. And I think it comes down to, so much of it comes down to leadership. We did quite a bit of qualitative studies across different schools, and schools that were, schools in which announcements were made, like, okay, we're going to move to this different kind of model. Here's what you're going to do. And that was it. Those schools were anxious. Staff were really concerned. They felt they were on their own. They felt they didn't have support. And they were resistant to this idea of moving through this and making good with this change. However, for schools in which leadership was like, I'm with you, we're doing this together, and had initiated a lot of staff buy-in, a lot of PD, a lot of support in terms of learning, a lot of support in terms of showing the evidence, and listening to their staff, those schools worked. the changes were made and they're doing great. So I think that that leadership accounts for so much of what we're seeing.
But who's hiring those leaders? Like, you know, why are the universities hiring people like you and the school boards aren't?
I don't know.
Jackie?
That's a really,
Jackie, what do you think?
I think there are folk out there, right? I do. I mean, I know them. I know the people that are champions of inclusion, and that's what we need, right? We need more champions of inclusion. We have those directors as well as the superintendents who want to learn about the research and how we do this, right? And so we just need more of them, and I think it needs to spread, right? I think that's, I mean, Gillian, you talked about it at the beginning that, you know, when school boards are huge, it's a big ship, right, to change, as opposed to perhaps a little boat that we can, everybody that can make spec ed work is sitting in this boat. Well, we just turn it around, right? So I think it's a groundswell. I think it's coming. I think, I mean, I've been very impressed with changes that Toronto has made. I mean, sure, they're not there, but as you spoke about, Diane, I don't think any board is there. So it's coming, right? And I think the more that we collaborate with school districts and individual schools to do the research, to work with the practitioners, to have the policymakers included, right? Then it's going to change. It's not changing fast enough, I know, Diane, but it's better.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think I misunderstood your initial question, but absolutely, there are tons of folks in leadership positions within the system that are really pushing towards this change. And I think that some of the issues that are driving the changes in Toronto too come from all different kinds of communities that are done seeing their children overrepresented in special education. There are groups and communities representing different racial groups and different cultures and different immigration status, all that are gathering together and are pushing for this change as well. So I feel like it's a complex narrative around inclusion at TDSB, but it's a really important one and the leadership in place is making it happen. Like
what you say is encouraging, but I wonder if one of the issues is that those good examples, those exemplars, are not being made well known in the community. Like, are they known widely, the schools that are doing a really good job at being inclusive? Are the teachers who do and the principals who do a really good job, are they getting recognition for it within their own board or within their community? Maybe there's not enough emphasis on, quote, sharing the good news of those that have done well.
That's a good point. Again, it comes back to what Jackie was mentioning about just the size of the board. I think, and because of where I sit with all of this, I hear a lot of great stories about what's taking place. In fact, we're actually working on a documentary film that will be showcasing some of the good work that's happening within TDSB. So stay tuned for that. COVID's put a bit of a wrench in that project.
So maybe one of the investments might be in that kind of celebration of success, as opposed to tackling the instances where things are not working well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, I think that's the issue, right, Gordon? I mean, the newspapers take up the negative stuff, right?
Right.
When I've spoken to them, I say, you know, there's lots of good stuff going on out there. Why don't you print that? Because I think that's what we need to do. And Gillian, I'm so excited to hear about this movie coming out, because I think we do have to showcase that it does work, and here's how it works, right?
So we've pretty well exhausted our time, Gillian. Can you just share with us one last thought about what's the research? Your emphasis at York is as a research professor. Can you share with us a teaser sort of what you're working on now and what we might anticipate in the next major research product that we see from you?
Sure. So I'll just tell you two quick projects that we're working on as a pretty big research teams on both. But one of them is actually an institutional ethnographic study looking at how families come to understand the process through which they either enroll in special education or within streaming processes in high school. So that's supposed to launch in a week or two. And then I'm also working with Dr. Carl James and Dr. Rob Brown on a project where we've merged data from the TDSB to York University, so we can track students from kindergarten all the way through to post-secondary graduation, which has been really interesting. We have a preliminary report that's just been released, kind of doing an overview, and it gives initial hints around the impact of special education enrollment and streaming on university graduation. So even so, still students make it in. What are the legacy implications of those programs? And so we're investigating that as well.
So if you have research that you can share with our listeners and others, if you would email it to us, we'll put it on our website, inclusiveeducation.ca.
Sure, absolutely. I one more quick one I can share with you as soon as we end the call, but we just did a study too around self-identification of disability and special education, looking at how identities, institutional or self, interact or not. And the results were quite surprising. So I'm happy to share that piece with you as well.
Okay, time to wrap it up. Thanks for chatting. Thanks for chatting with us, Gillian. It's been great, and like Diane said, it's very encouraging that we have people like yourself working in this field in Canadian universities today, and gives us hope for the future. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks a lot.
Gillian.